I mean, we can think of all these great classic rock records that were recorded in 3 days. And then when the band becomes like a big, huge success and they have like $1.5 million and a year and a half to do the record, it takes them a year and a half and $1.5 million, where if you gave them, $20,000 in a month, they'll probably make a great record.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. Hello, rock stars. It's your host, Lid Shaw, and welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to meet with recording professionals to hear their stories and learn from their experiences so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Mike Radovsky, a drummer, producer, and a composer for music licensing and film and TV. I first met Mike on a country recording session here at the Toy Box Studio and was struck by how great his drums sounded and how easy it was for me to record his drums. Turns out that Mike has played with many great artists, including Tanya Tucker, Tom Kimmel, Gary Morris, Bill Lloyd, and Marshall Crenshaw, to name a few. And of course, I realized it was the drummer, not the drums, that sounded so good. So we got to talking about music production and music licensing, and that led us to get together later to create an instrumental album called Sons of Billy Jack with the great guitarist Steve Sirkvencic.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I always called him Steve C.
Yeah, well, that's what everybody calls him.
Mike has been creating cool library music ranging in style from surf rock to heavy guitar blues and has lots to teach us about the world of music licensing. His credits include placements in music libraries like Sonoton APM, Groove Addicts, Smartsound, and Peer Publishing. And he's written music for major car commercials like Ford, Jeep, and Lexus, and has had many placements on ABC, CBS, Fox, HBO, and Showtime. Mike has even created music placed in one of the best shows ever made for TV, Breaking Bad. Nice, dude.
Dumb luck.
Please welcome Mike Radovsky to Recording Studio Rockstars. Mike, are you ready to rock?
I'm ready.
So, Mike, thank you so much for joining us on Recording Studio Rockstars. I've introduced you. Can you tell us more about who you are in your own words and how you got into all this music stuff?
Well, I mean, I've been playing drums for longer than I even want to think about. I lived in Nashville a long time. And as we all know, the music business is changing rapidly. So you kind of have to come up with more ways to skin a cat, as it were. And I want to say like maybe 12 or 13 years ago, there was a company in town. They changed names a couple of times. Now they're called IV Entertainment, and they basically do audio branding. But at the time I met the owners of the company, they were a music house where they created music for commercials, local, some larger market, and national. They did a lot of pretty high profile national commercials. And before they'd gone more national, in my ignorance, I noticed that most of the music that I had done for them, and this was me just playing drums and hand percussion for them. I was a musician. I said, hey, could I write some stuff for you guys? Because they didn't have a lot of, quirky or oddball stuff. And much to my amazement, they gave me a tiny budget to record fake Coke commercial and a fake Taco Bell commercial. And that sort of led to me being an outsource. I wasn't staff, but I was an outsourced composer for them. So that's kind of when I got into that. And then that led to maybe a few years later, a friend of mine wrote music for what's called a music library. And it's a library that used to be in Nashville called One Music. It's no longer here. They still exist as they were bought up by another music library called FirstCom, who's owned by Universal, that's what's happening in the business. Everybody's getting bought up. But I did a CD for them, and that sort of got me into the music library world, which has gotten me all the placements. But it all started with me writing music for commercials.
So when you talk about doing a CD for them, describe to us what that process was like for you at that time. I mean, what does it mean to make a CD for them?
Well, I had sent them, and this is how far back it's going, because as you know, everything's like changed so much. I sent them a physical CD, which was a demo of just the massive amount of music I'd written demoed for commercials, because back in the old days when there was tons of money in advertising, and I don't know how many of you remember the good old days where there was just huge budgets even for just demoing something. Like a company would come up with a product, they need a campaign for it, then they would go to maybe 5 or 6 music houses and go, we want this kind of music, and they might give you reference tracks. But I might write 6 pieces of music where they only need like 3. So there's all this extra stuff. So anyway, I sent them a demo and they liked what I did. And it was a variety of stuff. It was like everything from like Esquivel type track to a, Hound Dog Taylor sounding blues track. It was like all over the map. And so they proposed the idea of me doing Cool Commercials Volume 4, which was music targeted for the ad world, 60-second spots of any style you can imagine.
Right. And style is important, right? It's like, it's not just random that you're dropping all these names and reference to each track. I mean, it's like very intentional that you want it to be stylistic.
Well, it just depends on the project. Like certain projects that a library might propose would be real specific. Like they want a certain kind of music. One of the first things I did for Sonoton, which is a big German library, was something that was in the style of, modern garage alt rock, a la, White Stripes, Black Keys, Hives.
Yeah, did you notice I said heavy guitar blues band rather than mention those guys?
Well,
but I mean, that was what I had in mind.
No, I know, but that's a whole subject in and of itself. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of still very big now. I mean, that was when the Black Keys really started making money, was when it's a great story of, when they started letting their music be used for commercials.
So a quick question for you.
Sure.
When you were making White Stripes and Black Keys style tracks, did you put any bass on them?
Yeah, we did, sometimes. And, and I like to, depending on who you're working for, I like to, it's a little bit of dancing on the edge of the volcano. I like to pay homage to a band or a style as opposed to, tweaking notes just so you don't get sued.
Right. I like that. Dancing on the edge of a volcano. That's a good quote, man. I'm about to ask you for your quote, and that's a pretty good one to start with. There,
all right.
I picture you sort of like looking at it and going, well, the White Stripes and Black Keys, they did pretty good there, but I think we can do one better. We got this bass we're going to add on to it too,
Well, sometimes limitations are fun. It just kind of depends.
Yeah, totally. I'm joking around. But
I know.
Absolutely. Let me ask you this question. So you talked about the ad industry used to be big budget for the music production. What's changed? Why does the ad industry not have big budget for music anymore?
I can't say I have like the definitive answer, but as I see it, as with most aspects of our economy in general, not just the music business, there isn't a lot of middle ground anymore. I felt pretty comfortable being like the anonymous guy that, wrote original music for a commercial or whatever purpose. And, you could make decent money, but what's happened now, and you'll probably see it, like, you watch TV anymore, a company will either pay the gigantic licensing fee for like a Who track, or they'll go to a music library, which is the least expensive way to acquire music. And there's just no in between anymore. That's the biggest change as I see it. I'm not saying it doesn't exist at all, but it's for the most part like gone away.
Interesting. So it's probably just the presence of so many more easy options for licensing and through all these online libraries that has sort of maybe lowered the bar too.
It's hard to say what the chicken or the egg is. There's just a chicken running around in the yard and it's there. You can't ignore it. That's what's happened. But I see it in all aspects of our economy, not just the music. Larger and larger entities are just buying up rather than like in the early days of music. And this is before I got into the music library thing. A library was a business that would start from scratch where they had to have a pretty good chunk of money to create a ton of music, and think of it, if you're going to use like a whole full live orchestra or whatever, and you're spending a lot of money, and the dream was to get to however many tracks you felt was appropriate, like, 20,000, 10,000, then you kind of hope a bigger library would acquire you. And then you either get out and retire or, just start another one. But that's all anything really is anymore, is just bigger and bigger companies.
Right.
Like all the libraries that you mentioned that I wrote for, other than Sonoton, have been acquired by a bigger library.
Right. So one place to go for collecting music if you're looking for licensed music.
Yes.
All right. Well, so Mike, can you share with us an inspirational quote, something kind of get us psyched up? I know now that we just brought it down a little bit, let's get psyched back up.
Well, and I don't know if this is like a rah quote, but it's something that I think applies to art, but it also applies to business. And it's something that, for better or worse, has served me pretty well, which is I've always believed that 100% of nothing is nothing. And I don't know how inspirational it is, but for me, I've just seen, there's artists that I've worked with or just situations I've seen where people get real precious about whatever their idea is, whether it's like a song or a production idea or how they want to create music or any kind of art. And I think you should have a vision for what you do. And I definitely do. Like, obviously, like when we came in and worked on the thing we did, I had like an idea of what I wanted. But it's like, you might go, hey, let's put this vintage keyboard on this. Or, Steve comes up with an idea to play. You're kind of stupid not to access that idea. But sometimes, whether it's you get too precious about your idea creatively or you're worried about not making enough money, you'll just be so focused on, well, this is what I want to do. I want to be the sole writer. I want to be the sole producer, the sole creator, the sole financial benefactor of whatever it is. And for me, it's like, I understand my limitations and I enjoy working with other people. And it means I got to split the pie up more. But I could say, go off and learn how to be a great engineer like you in 20 years. Or I can make as much music as I humanly possibly can in a shorter period of time by letting you do what you do. If that makes any sense.
Right, yeah, interacting with people and collaborating and looking for those opportunities.
I've created, in less than 10 years, I've got almost 500 tracks circulating.
Nice, dude. So. Yeah, well, I don't have 500 tracks made on my own. In fact, I think I took the opposite approach, which just says, I've got 0% of everything, dude. That's pretty impressive, isn't it?
Hey, you're making a little bit on what we did.
I'm kidding.
Know.
But that's a great quote. It's a great reminder, too. And I've seen that in the past myself, because I've seen bands have, and people approach the music industry with this protective nature that says, an opportunity comes along. Maybe traditionally it was a record label opportunity and it was saying, hey, you can sign with us and you're going to get a certain percentage or give up a certain percentage. And it's, people might be really like, man, I'm not going to give up 50%, 10%, 25%, whatever it is. But, that reminder of saying, well, 50% of something is better than 100% of nothing. So
yeah, and don't get me wrong, I'm not for creatively or financially, like trying to see your vision the way you see it, but I've just seen it work kind of detrimentally, the other way, probably more often than not.
Yeah, I guess the real takeaway from that is make sure that when you partner up and that percentage you're sharing in revenue or in opportunity or in creation with somebody, that you're partnering with somebody who really has 50% to contribute.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Often there's people that I create this music with, and I might come in with the piece of music, whatever it is, fully written. But what I like to do, because I like to, and that gets into I'm sure we'll get into that, like, well, how do you make money doing this? And I may write the piece, but I'll find somebody that plays multiple instruments, has a recording facility, is a good engineer, so I don't have to involve tons of people, which, can sometimes dilute creatively what you want to do, but also keeps the budget compact. But I'll go, hey, he's playing all these instruments, he's recording it, I'll give him half the writing. To me, it's well worth it. I couldn't have done it without him. So,
well, as evidenced by the nature of the music licensing library, world, as it is, there's more value in having 500 songs out there than just having one and hoping that that's going to be the hit.
Absolutely. It's a numbers game. Like, you just have to have a ton of stuff out there, not just because, you're hoping one will hit, but when you look on whether your ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, whoever your PRO is, and that's who collects your writing royalties, you're seeing, $2, 25 cents, sometimes, $1,200. I mean, it's all over the map, but you're creating smaller streams of income as opposed to thinking you're going to make like one big giant. It's not like you're going to make a hit record.
Yeah. Well, so Mike, I like to refer to our listeners as the rock stars and give them a shout out every moment here and there. And rock stars, I wanted to point out that when Mike talks about PRO and he's talking about ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, those are performance rights organizations. That's what it stands for. And those are the organizations that make it their mission to bring all the writers together, keep track of who owns the writing share of songs, and then they go out into the world and they find out where those songs are being used so that they can collect the potential income from those songs being used in film and TV, on radio, played on live stages, and et cetera. And with that understanding, it's really important to really know how to work with your PRO. Do you have to pick one, or can you pick multiple PROs?
You pick one, but boy, this is real. And I'm actually embroiled in a bit of a pickle with that situation right now, but that might be for a later discussion. But I picked my PRO initially just out of ignorance. And that wasn't that it was a good or bad PRO. I had just, 20 years ago, I was playing on a friend of mine's record, and we actually wrote a song together. And I was told, well, you got to create a publishing company. You got to get a PRO. So I just signed with one that somebody said, here, sign with them. Because I kind of thought they all do basically the same thing. And then when I got heavy into writing for TV and film, I was told by a number of composers for TV and film, and even a couple of libraries, that one in particular was better for TV and film. So in 2012, I switched from one to another. So I had maybe 170 tracks with the original one. And you do have the option of bringing your catalog with you, but that's really complicated. And you have to contact all the publishing entities that you wrote for to do it. So I figured I'll just leave everything there. And then henceforth, everything I write from now on will be with a newer PRO.
So what do you recommend to somebody who's just getting started in this, in terms of how do they find out which PRO to choose from? And also, what are the choices?
Well, it's changing. In the States, as far as I know, there's BMI, there's ASCAP, and there's CSAC. And foreign royalties, I mean, each country has their own. Like in Japan, it's JazzRack, and Gemma, I think, is the one in Germany. They will pay to your domestic PRO. And of course, they get their share. They get a bite out of that. But I would just do what I did. Just talk to your friends who do the same thing. And, different ones are supposedly better for different things. Like I switched to the one that I was told was better for, TV and film, but that might not be as good for songwriting. But as you know, the music business, like year to year, things are changing all the time. And these companies are huge too, and they don't always keep up with what's going on technically. Like now, streaming is like, for everybody, it's the big matzo ball.
Right.
So
and
it's whoever can keep up with that, So just talk to people and see what they think.
Okay, so let's cover still some of the basics as much as you feel comfortable doing.
Sure. Well, let me say this first. There's many shades in between, but there's two basic types of libraries. There's the, real big traditional ones like, Nonstop Music, First Com, Sonoton, where in essence, they're a publisher. So what they will do is they will give me money to create a collection of music. It's anywhere from 10 to 16 tracks. And they'll pay, it varies, but it's generally from between $500 and $1,200 a track to create the music. And what you're doing at that point, and you guys will have to just sort of look it up, but you're creating what's called a work for hire. And so as the publishing company, they keep the publishing. And in most cases, all the sync license That's another, I mean, we can get into that or you can look that up, but I'm just trying to give you the big picture. And what you always get is your writer's share, which is your PRO money. And what you're giving it up for it being a work for hire is they're giving, they might give me like $12,000 to, make a record for them, which, if you're smart, you can keep a lot of that money and then you'll get, back end through your royalties.
Right. So, and I apologize for having to keep going back to some basics, but there is the writer's share of that music being used somewhere, and that is the money that comes through the PRO to you as a writer.
Correct.
But then there's also what you call the sync licensing, which is kind of the same as master use, right? Yeah, which is, and that's the recording.
Sure.
That's the permission to use that recording.
That's
of that
like
song.
A contract they sign to attach audio to video. It's and in some ways it's sort of an antiquated term, but it's also the way things are going. It's not completely gone, but that's like something that's going away. Like one of the larger consumers of music, particularly what I do, is reality TV. Mm-hmm. You might not think about it, but if you watch a show, it might be quiet, but it's like wall to wall music.
Yeah.
So they'll use like tons of pieces in one, half-hour show. And their lure is, well, we won't pay a sync license, but these shows are going to be re-aired like a bazillion times. So you get more on the back end.
Interesting. Even though reality TV is kind of like saying, well, what happened today was good for this show, but tomorrow we're going to do another show for more reality. So I don't know if we're really going to play yesterday's show or not.
Yeah, but I mean, that's kind of the way it is. So there's sync license money. And then interestingly enough, because it involves, something we did together, there's the mechanical royalties, which is physical sales or like a physical download. And the first bit of success we had with what we did was with a library called Smartsound. Their model is a little bit different. All their income is generated, it's based on physical sales and downloads. So when we receive money from them, it's for the physical sale of a CD or a download.
Interesting. Well, so Rockstars, one thing I want to point out to you is that I remember as I first began to learn this stuff, we're going back 20 years, school, and my first introduction to, well, there's writer shares. Well, there's master use. Well, the writer share, you've got half of the writer share because the other half goes to your publisher and all this confusing stuff.
It's based on 200%, which makes no sense.
Right. But so my takeaway from it is it often felt very confusing to try and understand. And then, then you dig in deeper and you're like, well, I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to get it and I'm going to understand it. And inevitably, what you discover is that what you understand is already changed by the time you understand it. So don't sweat the details too much. Like Mike says, go into the website, read it, learn what you can. Be aware that the way things are done is partly the way things are done. If you go join a music library, they're probably just going to have everything you need to know right there as you sign up for that library to contribute. And let that be your learning process. Be aware that some of the terminology is just like it's outdated, ancient terminology that happens to describe money flowing from one place to another, and it's got to be allocated some way. So I don't know if that's helpful, but my point is it can be confusing. Don't avoid taking advantage of the opportunity just because it's so confusing. Just jump in and go for it.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's things that I did 8 years ago that I don't do anymore. And, sometimes I might go, I wish I would have, but you just learn and you move on. But I would say this too, to add to what you're saying, or you touched on it a little bit, is I feel for all I've learned about, the ins and outs of publishing, I feel like I don't know anything. And this is certainly no insult to my friends at BMI or ASCAP or wherever else, but often when I talk to them, I feel like I don't know a whole lot less than they know. and one, without getting into it, one little issue I'm going through now, it's like I've heard from a couple of these companies, like what you don't want to hear from a doctor, which is, well, I've never seen that before.
Right.
So I honestly think that publishing is so intentionally confusing as to be able to basically screw the composer or the writer. I mean, it's like, it's an unbelievable maze. So to tie up what Lidge said, yeah, you need to learn how this stuff works in a general sense, but don't, you'll feel like you're spending a whole week on the phone chasing $50, and you don't want to do that.
Yes, good point.
You got to see the big picture.
There was this is just a little analogy, but I remember a story my brother once shared with me about backpacking in China when he was young. And he had this sense that he was always being taken advantage of as soon as they realized he was an American kind of traveling through a poor rural part of China or something. And he got on a bus once and they gave him a different price for him to get on the bus. And he got so infuriated. He threw a big fuss and was yelling at the bus driver and everything. He's feeling like, I'm going to stand up for my rights here. And then when he was all done, he sat down finally after like the big, to-do and realized that he had just argued over like 24 cents or something like that. So just remember to keep your eye on where your time is most valuably spent and what it's really worth.
Absolutely.
Pursuing.
I mean, you're one of the most, disciplined guys. Is okay, I'm going to do the, you're way better than me about that. But at the same time, issues will come up and nobody's going to fight for you quite like you will. So you do have to kind of stay on top of it.
Yeah.
Because things will come up. So if you do get into this, and I'm not saying it's easy, but I would try to develop relationships and friendships, not only with people at the libraries you might be fortunate enough to work for, but also I've got a friend at BMI, I've got a friend at ASCAP, where there's a personal relationship. And now, because of, one of these issues I'm going through now, I mean, developing a relationship with somebody at CSAC.
Yeah, networking and relationships are always
absolutely
big part of making this stuff work. All right, so Mike, you've done a lot of great stuff. You've made 500 music tracks. That can sometimes seem a little daunting to those of us who are just getting started on this path. Help humanize it for us a little bit and share with us a story of a moment of real failure for you where it all kind of didn't work out so well, but maybe became a great learning experience.
You mean as far as like in general, or just like in general, musical?
Maybe in your career of music or in music licensing or as a drummer?
Well, for me, this is taking a left field from the writing thing, but as a drummer, when I first moved to Nashville, and I'd never lived anywhere where, to all you guys that live here, obviously it, how fast things move in the recording studio. And this is me. I moved here from Boston, where if you were starting a band that played original music, you'd rehearse for like 6 months, multiple times a week before you'd go out and play your first gig. Where in Nashville, you go in the studio and you got to sound like a band in, 10 minutes. So I remember, the first times, I might be recording Nashville, working on, whether it was like a demo or, somebody's record, and I'd go, well, can't we spend a little more time to, come up with something extra cool for the bridge? And, depending on the budget and what kind of thing it was like not always appropriate. So that certainly bit me on the rump more than once.
Yeah, somebody was like, I think it would be extra cool to blow off your suggestion.
Yeah, or nobody will say it. They just won't hire you again. And another thing was if I'd come back and listen to the track, and, I'm often very hard on myself about, a performance. I'd listen to something I did and I'd hear something, and it might even be something sort of relatively insignificant, but once again, not gauging, the time we had to spend or whatever. I'd go, that sucks. Can't I do it again? And this was before the days of editing or tweezing. Right.
You guys are recording on tape. You got to erase what you just did if you're going to replace it.
Yeah. It's like you got to do the whole, because everything was on the drummer. I mean, it still kind of is, but I sort of didn't realize that I'm telling a room full of people that the basic track is fine, that, well, you're an idiot for not hearing how bad it is. So that, I've done things like that, which did not serve me well. But, you just, when in doubt, you're probably better off to just keep your mouth shut.
So interesting. You're basically, to say it back to you, it's that drive to make things creatively really top notch that is part of your creative process, but that kind of biting you in the ass by either slowing down the recording session or inadvertently suggesting that other people's perspective on what's good is short-sighted compared to yours. What's the balance of that? So, and those are insightful things to understand, as far as participating in a session and collaborating with people and making sure that you're contributing in a positive way to moving this group effort forward. But what about that thing that also says, you want to over-deliver, you want to make things better than people expect? How do you balance that out?
Well, I mean, and everything is relative. You have to gauge the situation. Like in Nashville, and that's not to say different levels of quality, because it's, just the level of quality of musicianship and the recording business here is just so high. But you have to gauge things from the budget or the kind of project it is. And I've done tons of custom records where you have to do 10 or 11 tracks in 7 or 8 hours. So do the math. I mean, it's like sometimes during that first run through where you're just reading the chart for the first time, basically you've sat there, somebody's made a chart from the demo. First time you're playing it, they're rolling, you're in record. And if the drum track is good, when the acoustic guy's doubling or the electric guy's putting a solo on, I'm putting a tambourine track on or a shaker. You got to move that fast. So if it's one of those kind of things, which is different than if you're playing on a master session that's a record, whether it's on a big indie or a major label where, hey, let's spend some time. You just have to gauge what the situation is. I'm always trying to do as great a job, be as creative as I can be, but you just have to gauge the situation. And it's not just you. Everybody's, got to get their parts on in a, efficient way.
So if you're trying to deliver the very best Mike Radovsky drum track on a super fast session, basically your only chance to improve it is before you ever got to the session. Just be well rehearsed and have your shit together. Right?
Yeah, you just have to be, a competent player.
What about, have you learned anything about sort of trusting your intuition in the moment so that you can have sparks of great ideas, but very quickly?
When you're doing something where you're moving that quickly, I mean, it sort of has to happen that way. I mean, your instincts as far as like, hey, what I'm going to do when I go to the chorus, or what can I do that's a little different on the bridge? And often, even if you have like a ton of time, and that's a whole kind of concept we can get into too. Sometimes having too much time, I mean, I always think of it like what's the analogy of like, the goldfish only gets as big as the bowl he's in. I mean, we can think of all these great classic rock records that recorded in 3 days. And then when the band becomes like a big, huge success and they have like $1.5 million and a year and a half to do the record, it takes them a year and a half and $1.5 million. Where if you gave them, $20,000 in a month, they'll probably make a great record.
Right. And that's also known as Parkinson's Law, which says that any task will expand to fit the time allotted for it.
Ah, well, I had never, so there you go. That's the goldfish. But often, I'm not like a Nazi about it, but there can be magic. Your instincts take over when it's like the first thing you come up with, sometimes is good. And I've often, back in the old days, when there was a lot of time, when you're doing like 8 million takes, I mean, we all know this, even as an engineer, once you get past like 5, I'm not saying it can't be done. It's just very difficult to like keep your energy up. There's a lot of, spunk on those early takes. And sometimes just when you're flying by the seat of your pants, that's when you get something sort of magical, or something that might even be a mistake is like, wow, that's kind of cool.
There's a great chart on the wall in the kitchen right behind me from Walter Sears, who had Sears Sound in New York City. And he's drawn this, it's this graph where kind of the line goes up a little bit, and then it just starts going down the graph, and then it goes way out, and then it has this spike at the very end, and it's just off. And it's sort of like first take, is pretty brilliant. It's almost about as good as it's ever going to get. Second take might be there. Third take is like, everybody's got their parts figured out, but it's not quite as full of life as those first two. And then everything just starts getting worse and worse and worse until you get way out in line. And then you have this spike of like, it's called like anomaly of brilliance or something like that, where you get this take that's almost as good as that first one, maybe just a little bit better. but it's like, take 52, and then it's just brain death after that.
Well, and it's funny because some of the records I've played on where I feel like I played the best were when we didn't learn what we were going to do in the recording studio. Because by the time you've learned, and this is if you're coming up with like weird parts or
just understanding
uncomfortable.
The song,
yeah,
right?
understands. Yeah, because sometimes it's not about, oh, this is the most difficult drum part or I got to do something complicated. It might take you a while to come to the conclusion that something very simple to play is the best thing, but sometimes that takes time. So there's projects that I've played on where to me, the best use of time was to go somewhere and rehearse, not rehearse it to death, just to where like, hey, this is the vibe. These are our parts. So that when you go to record, you're basically going for a performance. You're not in the studio learning a part.
Right.
But that's, again, different than, when you're recording custom records or demos. You don't have time for that. But whenever there's time to do that, I always felt the most comfortable doing that. But that also brings up to me something that I think with technology, and I always like to think, you can use these powers for good or for evil. And the evil part is, to me, is like, basically if you don't have any ideas or you haven't written anything and people can't play really all that well, it's really easy to make something that sounds great using, computer technology. You can just tweeze things to death and edit and cut and paste where you've got something
without mistakes,
or that sounds great. But to me, it's like, come on, is that why we're in this? But to me, one of the great things about, and as a drummer, because it's all on the drums to like get the track right.
I already had this vision while you were talking about that the first time of the Atlas figure carrying the earth, but it's just a giant kick drum, I don't know if anybody's made that logo yet, but that'd be pretty good.
Well, there you go. Well, it's kind of almost the Rush logo. But anyway, I do have to say I love the fact that with computer technology now, you can punch a drum track virtually anywhere. I mean, it still amazes me. Like when I remember what people used to have to go through to, with editing or, splicing tape. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. But now, if we use this in what I think it would be the most positive sense, use the fact that you can punch anywhere as a vehicle to be more, not reckless, but you can play with more abandon, knowing if I get this great, super energetic, creative take, but I just need to punch in one place. To me, that's liberating.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I love being able to get a take that has got, 95% or whatever, 99% of what you want in the song, but then just kind of fix that spot. Because what happens a lot of time is it's partly out of laziness maybe, or it's partly out of just, the fear that it's going to take a little too much thinking. But you get a take that might be great from a band, from a drummer. And yet when you're producing, if you're on this side of the glass, you're aware of these few moments where that could just be a little better, and then you're inclined to say, hey, can we fix those things and let's do another take?
Yeah.
And you're kind of missing the point sometimes when it really all you need to do, like you said, is just punch in those two little spots and just fix them.
And again, it's like missing the big picture. The big picture is, hey, this is what we want, and if that's all it takes, I mean, to me, that's liberating. And, you kind of hit on something too, which I had an interesting reminiscing discussion with a engineer friend of mine who, this was years ago, and I'm not going to name names, but I had recommended him to mix a project that I had played on because they wanted somebody that could really mix it and, make it like super rockin'. And I'd never thought about this till it came up, but he went on to describe this process of when, and you know how this works, where when you're mixing something, you as an engineer, you got to use your instincts. You come in, you basically get the thing mixed. And then when the artist or producer comes in, you're tweaking things. Hey, ride the vocal there a little bit, let's like re-EQ the guitar solo or whatever. You're not like starting from scratch. You're giving him something that's maybe 85% there. Yeah,
you're enabling the producer to be able to make some simple decisions to make the mix better too.
Absolutely. So this friend of mine, he brought the mixes up to where he thought things were, basically pretty appropriate. And the artist who had now become the producer, too long and weird of a story, says, that sounds great. Okay, let's start with the kick drum. So he's basically starting at square one. And I'd never thought of the concept that getting a mix is like tracking. It's you come up with something about once, and I'm sure we've all heard stories of like how things are just mixed and remixed so many times that you kind of completely lose perspective on, what's even going on anymore. And you kind of lose that. It's similar to getting a basic track, where you've got only so many shots at it before you'd kind of, lose perspective on how it's supposed to go.
Right. What's the expression? You can only polish a turd so much before you just get shit everywhere.
Well, and it's not even that it could be something that's like really great. But I even remember hearing there was some, prog record that was recorded in the 80s where it was remixed so many times they actually, physically, wore the tape out. It just sounded like crap.
Right.
So
let's jump into some other stuff here. I wanted to ask you some specific geek out kind of stuff.
Oh boy.
Let's get into how about getting great drum sounds, because you're somebody who I noticed getting great drum sounds in the studio. And then, like I said, it was the drummer, not the drums, but it's also partly the drums. I mean, because you make sure you keep a great kit.
And it's the engineer too. I mean,
what are some low hanging fruit for somebody who just needs some tips for getting great drum sounds on their recording sessions? What are some basic things that people need to be aware of?
Well, I'm, as far as like the drums you're using, that's obviously a big part of it, and I'm kind of a Gretsch fanatic. But the reason being, they're the most flexible sounding instrument that I've ever played. Like if you tune them tight, like if you're doing something that's sort of like jazzy, a lot of drums will go dead if you tune them tight. Like some drums only sound good if you tune them tubby, which is real low. And the thing I've always loved about Gretsch is everything is there. If you want to muffle them or go Ringo and put tea towels on them or whatever, they'll do whatever you want. So having a good sounding instrument and knowing how to tune them is obviously important. And, the way you play, I mean, if somebody else plays my drums, it's going to sound different than if I play them. And that's, that's a real personal, it's the same thing with a guitar player or anybody play any instrument.
So now sometimes you must have had to sit down on a non-Gretsch kit or a kit that may have been a little bit limited. Are there some simple tricks for people to be aware of for, ways to kind of improve the kick drum sound when it doesn't come out sounding right at the beginning? What are the first things you reach for? And snare drum sounds?
Well, then again, you have to gauge like how much time is there. Like if you're working in a studio where they've got a house kit, the reason they have that house kit is generally we're going to move really fast. You have to gauge how much time you have. And if there's a session I'm doing where there's a house kit, I'll still always bring things that make me comfortable. Like I'll, bring my cymbals, and it's not just me. Most people do this. I'll bring my own snare drums, and generally in a situation where I don't even really know what's going to be going on, I'll bring just a couple, 2 or 3 snare drums, one that if I need it to be like real tubby and low, and then one that I can tweak, but, for a more mid or high sounding, snare. And then, but that's pretty much all you can do. I mean, I'll always, if there's time, I'll tweak the toms. I like them to sound big and get as much out of them as I can. Like I like a lot of sustain. I will say this, and this is another one of those situations. There was a record I was playing on, like 10 years ago. And the engineer was a friend of mine. He's done like a bunch of really big records, and we were recording at a really nice studio. And this was in the days when you could spend, a lot of time getting drum sounds, which I haven't done anything where you spend more than 15 minutes in a really long time. But we had a lot of time. I brought like a ton of snare drums, a lot of options. And, 4 hours is going by and I'm not really hearing much from the engineer. And just getting drum sounds can be a little taxing and sort of grueling. And finally, I asked him, I said, well, is there like a problem? And he says, well, everything just kind of sounds okay. And in my typical, I should probably never do it, but I didn't know what else to do after 4 hours. I said, hey, can you just come out here for a minute? And I hit my bass drum a few times, hit the snare drum, hit the toms. I go, well, how does that sound? And he says, oh, it sounds great. And I just kind of looked at him. And at that point, that's when your job as a drummer is done. If you're in the room and your drums sound good, that's kind of all you can do.
Right.
And if they're having an issue getting a sound on you, then, it's kind of on them.
Yeah.
So, but, that's again, in terms of,
Sorry about that, rock stars. This one's on you.
Yeah.
Well, so what about this, Mike? Occasionally you sit down, you've got a snare drum, and there are some typical things that can sound a little funny with it. If it's got a ring going on that you're not liking, it's kind of bong, it's got something like that. How do you treat something like that?
Well, I mean, and it depends on, the kind of ring it might be, because sometimes a little honk is kind of fun. You can EQ it into the drum, but I always am happy, if I, look over at Lidge and I go, hey, have you EQ'd anything? And he says, no, everything's like flat. And if it sounds really good flat, it's kind of like my philosophy on the drums. I want everything to be there so you can make it into what you want later, with any signal processing. But, I just want to get as great a sound as I can get flat and then, take it from there. But for me, generally, even if it's a drum that's tuned low, I crank the bottom head pretty tight because it gets the snares real active. That's, kind of one of my tricks. Mm-hmm. And for the toms, speaking in generalities, drums are different. And this is getting sort of tweaky about it. But in general, the bottom head is about a third or a minor third tighter than the top head. And that gives me like the most sustain.
Okay, cool. And then how do you even know what the tuning of an individual head is to know if the bottom head is a minor third tighter than the top head?
Well, I could sort of show you, but the way I do it is I'll hit the top head and really lightly with my other hand touch the center of the bottom head so you can hear the pitch of the top head, and then you reverse that and lightly touch the top head and hit the bottom head. Then you can truly hear like the pitch of the drum.
So the touching is sort of muting that one head. So
very slightly.
You don't hear that head, you hear the other one.
Yeah, so you hear the other head. And, that's the thing, unless you're using a thin synthetic, whether it's like if it's plexiglass or fiberglass, wood, just like with acoustic guitars, you might play 10 before you find one that you really like.
Right.
Drums aren't exact. So none of these are hard and fast rules. And now, I've been tuning my drums, the way I tune them for so long. I might check that, like I can feel the tension of the lugs to where I feel it, to where when I get the drum to sound good and then I check it for that pitch, it's generally about, the bottom head's a little, it's just something I don't
it's weird.
have to do it that much anymore.
In recording too, it's like the more familiar you get with the instruments and with the mics and everything, you begin to have an intuition about whether it's going to sound good without sort of having to hit it, listen to it, judge it. You just begin to know where to place a mic on an instrument as you get going.
And this too. There's engineers that I've worked with often enough that they kind of know what my drums sound. It just doesn't take all that long, All
right. Well, now tell us a little bit about drum effects. You've got drums that are in the space. It's an acoustic instrument. If you're recording acoustic drums, it is really that, and the piano are probably a couple of the most complex ones to record in the studio, I think, because they just involve a lot of overtones and a lot of mics, that's why mixing drums is such a challenge, is because there's just a lot of mics to get right out there. There doesn't have to be a lot of mics, but often there are. Talk to us about effects. What are some things that have seemed to work that you're aware of as far as once you're in the computer, the way you treat them, adding reverbs or adding delays or tricks that seem to be part of making a really good final drum sound? You got anything you want to share with us there?
Well, I'll preface this by saying, very boldly, I'm not an engineer. So as I kind of tried to communicate in that story, I feel like that once my drums sound good, I feel like, and I'm playing well, my job is done. But that said, I mean, getting back to your analogy of, Atlas holding the bass drum, for better or for worse, the drums, not only the groove creates so much of what the song is going to ultimately be, but also the drums kind of create the sonic landscape, if like the drum, if you're going for like a Zepp sound where it's like drums in a big giant concrete room, no matter what the other instruments sound like, that's going to kind of create a vibe. Or if you have like a bone dry, Macy Gray type 70s sounding funk track, that's going to be different. So when it comes to effects, to me, it's all determined by, well, what kind of vibe are you creating? And for me now, there's one engineer / co-writer that I've worked with a bunch, and especially on like these library projects where I have to do a huge variety of music, like all different styles from different eras on one record. The drum room that we recorded in, he realized he wouldn't have space to create, a big room. Like, you've got a nice sized room here that sounds really good. He didn't have that. So his thought pattern was, I'm going to make this room as dead as I can. So all you get out of the drum is the fundamental pitch. And then anything we want to do effects wise or vibe wise, we'll do with the plugins or outboard gear that he had. And that's worked really well. And, I'm sure now, and I'm not even sure what your preferences are, but the plugins are so good now. I mean, I'm just kind of amazed at how great they sound.
So you feel like you've had the experience of hearing somebody add plug-in reverb and space around a drum kit and have it sound great in the end?
I've done a bunch of music that would be considered sort of vintage or classic music, where we're sort of trying to create a 50s, 60s sound, which is, very different from today. And there's a plugin, and this is more PC oriented, but I'm sure there's a Mac platform one, but it was called Magneto. And it's an analog tape simulator where it just flawlessly, mimics analog tape. I mean, you can really make that Cannonball Adderley where the drums, toms, and snare were tuned real tight, and they kind of almost sound like they're blowing up the mics, but it was in a real cool way. And we could do that, just from doing it a lot. I've noticed things that I like. But at that point, I have to sort of, defer to the engineer. And I'm not beyond, whether it's me as a player or me when I communicate, something to an engineer. Like, I'll say, hey, let's reference this track on a CD and, see if we can kind of get close to that. And I think that's a great thing to do,
Yeah.
Why not?
I think it's cool to hear you describe it too, because it's your understanding of what that initial reference is, what the style is, and your description of the sense of what it's like to play the drums into that sound. So for example, you might not know what the mic was or exactly where it was supposed to go or how to get the compressor to do the thing in Pro Tools, but you do know that as the drummer, it should feel like you're, quote, blowing up the mics as you play this tight and probably kind of quietish.
Play quieter, use like skinnier sticks.
And that I think is really insightful as far as understanding, okay, I get it now. I see how that sound is created. So that's cool stuff. So we'll take a break here in just one sec, but give us something cool for creating that like 60s surf drum sound. Tell us a little bit about that. And I don't even have one specific in mind, but I like hearing your stories about stuff like that.
It's maybe tuning the snare a little tighter. And a lot of that for me is just like playing the appropriate stuff. But, if you listen to like Ventures records or just, any records from that era, I mean, and this is all drum nerd stuff. I mean, Hal Blaine was kind of like the first guy to create that modern drum sound that we have now, where the toms are tuned lower and tubbier and the snare might be tuned like a little looser, but nobody did that before then. And I remember reading interviews with him where he said when he first did that, producers would fight for him, because engineers would go, you can't play so loud. I mean, he was the first, as dumb as it sounds now, and we see like, guys like Dave Grohl or, Tommy Lee, who just lift their arms over their heads to, play drums incredibly physically loud. I mean, people have no idea that in those days, you just didn't, they were all jazz drummers. The only guys that were session drummers were jazz players that could read music.
Right. That's why you always had that 60s jazz drum fill, which I can't really describe, but it's like, It's like real fast.
Yeah, you're playing double strokes and things that like rock guys, there just weren't rock. I mean, Hal Blaine was really sort of the first pop rock drummer. And there were stories of engineers going, no, you can't play that loud. You're going to like blow up the tube mics. So that was kind of a transition. But, and I'm not like, don't get me wrong. I mean, I like to get everything to be, appropriate to the period. But, I'm not a Nazi. I mean, I've done surf things where I'll still, leave my drums I won't tune them quite that high.
So, I mean, it's interesting that you're talking about Dave Grohl and, these heavy hitting drummers. And that certainly is a sound. And my experience says if something is really loud up close, then you would naturally stand back from it to listen to it. And you are also likely to find that standing back from it might be a really good place to put your mics. It's why if you put room mics up as you're building a string ensemble, that might sound like a big string orchestra because you're used to hearing a big string orchestra, many yards away from you up on the stage.
As opposed to a bunch of instruments mic'd up close.
Or a really loud guitar, a Marshall cabinet cranked way up. You're not used to putting your ear right up to the cabinet. You're used to hearing that standing back from it. Same thing with drums. But talk a little bit about the experience of overhitting the drums, because hitting loud and overhitting, you can also choke up drum sounds, right? And I know you told me that part of the secret for you hitting your drums and getting great tones was you said something like, I just kind of guide my sticks around and let them do the work.
Well, yeah, and that gets to like, just your playing technique. And I'm not, there's a zillion different ways to do that, but I think in general, and there obviously are exceptions to the rule, but you can hit drums, I think, sometimes so hard that they just don't sound quite as good. But also,
it's almost like the sound dies and never really
a
leaves
little
the
bit,
drum,
yeah,
right?
kind of can almost like choke the drum. I mean, there's a point of, kind of no return on that. But it's also in terms of your technique and time and feel. And like, I think Tommy Lee's great. And he, to me, is an exception where he could play like super hard and the time was good and it still felt good. But for, most people that I kind of see it go out the window. And a lot of drummers that we think of as really, because they get a big sound, didn't really play that loud. Like if you see footage of Bonham, who, is sort of considered, this prototypical heavy rock drummer, he didn't play with big fat sticks. His drums were tuned kind of tight, but real open, no muffling on the bass drum, two heads, no hole. And he, by today's standards, he didn't play that loud. And I've seen, it was kind of eye-opening for me when I, I'm kind of a nerd for buying like drum instructional videos and DVDs. And when I first got years ago, the Jeff Porcaro one, he's playing really thin sticks and just the backbeat. He wouldn't even move his right hand up in order to facilitate a big backbeat. Everything was very small in terms of his movements, but he got a huge sound.
So when you say right hand, so his right hand is on the hi-hat.
Right hand on the hi-hat.
It's all wrist on the hi-hat.
Yeah, all wrist and fingers. And often you'll see drummers that are, not even playing super loud, but just, at a moderate volume, they'll pick up their right hand to facilitate a backbeat.
Right. In other words,
visually, obviously you can't see that.
But that's my job. I get to explain it for the rock stars. So rock stars, he's talking about with your left hand hitting the snare. This is for a righty drummer.
Righty, yeah.
And in order to lift the left hand up high to really come down and whack the snare, you would have to move your right hand up high to get it out of the way. And that affects the timing of coming back down towards the hi-hat, right?
Yeah.
So that you really hear and feel that.
And you
in
have
the
to
groove.
compensate for it. Like, if just think about it, if you're moving your backbeat 6 inches or 3 feet, you have to compensate for time.
Yeah. Cool stuff.
So that's just never been, and I'm not a, particularly visual drummer. When I've seen myself play, I mean, it's like kind of boring, but some of my favorite, like Greg Morrow's like, one of my favorite drummers in town. He's this big guy, gets a big sound, and you hear a lot of stuff going on, but you don't see a lot of moving.
Yeah, right on, right on. All right, so we're going to take a break here and then come back for the jam session. But before we do, I want to ask you one last question, because this, I think, is a real pain point for us engineers and producers in recording drums in the studio: cymbals. How do we control the crashes so that they really sound beautiful in the final result and they're not screaming and ripping our heads off with mid-range? How do we control the hi-hat so that it's not, if we want to really boost up that snare, it's not all the hi-hat coming through?
First off, I would say for me, I always, and this was sort of a visual thing that I liked, drummers I liked at the time, I was really practicing a lot, kept their cymbals up like pretty high. And I just thought, like any like dumb kid, oh, it looks really cool. So I did it. But the obvious benefit of keeping your cymbals up high was they were pretty far away from the drums. So that's just something that for my drum sound, I guess was a part of it. I mean, engineers had told me, oh, I like the fact that your cymbals are up high because it helps. And as far as the relationship between the hi-hat and the snare, I mean, it wasn't anything that I was told by an engineer or was instructed to work on, just the natural way that I played. I just didn't play the hi-hat super loud, which, helps an engineer get a good snare sound. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I can't give you like a, magic formula. It was just fortunate that that's the way I play. I mean, there's some drummers that I've liked that kind of really lay into their hi-hat, and I know it's caused issues. But
do you find sometimes that in the verses, for example, if the hi-hat is doing a really precise eighth note pattern, that's the time to kind of dig in a little bit more and it's real quick sounding? But when it's a little sloshier or it's choruses, that's the time to be a little, lay back a little bit so that you can really make sure your snares are consistent and not have them. Because I've heard that a lot. I've heard drummers go to a chorus and the hi-hat loosens up. And on playback, I can point out, it's like, I don't know if you noticed this, but your snare went from precise in the verses to sort of hitting softer in the choruses.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, obviously, I mean, I get the whole kind of making your hi-hat slosher in the chorus because you want the chorus to sound big. But yeah, I mean, I'm always try to be real consistent, with my backbeats. I mean, obviously, if there's dynamics, like if there's a verse where you're supposed to play like, quietly, that's sort of different. But yeah, I mean, it's, just something, you learn how to do over the years. It's just, I always liked it when I would come in and if I would look at like, VU meters and see that like my kick drum was pretty much going to the same place every time I hit, and same with the snare drum. So, I mean, I definitely try to make it as easy for the engineer as I can, within reason. And conversely, I mean, I remember doing a session like, eons ago with an engineer that put a 421 on a tom, which, as you know, is like a pretty big giant mic. And it was like almost like dead center of the tom. And he kind of looks at me kind of saying, oh, is that going to be a problem? And I said, well, it won't be if I ever have to hit a tom. So you just, you have to kind of walk that line of, you want them to be able to get a good sound, but, you have to have your drums be playable.
Yeah.
So.
All right, cool. Well, we're going to take a break now, come back for the jam session. Rockstars, I want to remind you that you can find links to the stuff we're talking about in the show notes. I'm going to also see if I can ask Mike to send us a photo of his drum kit all set up so you can really see the cymbals up in the air and it's also a beautiful yellow Gretsch drum kit too. And just go to rsrockstars.com and then look for Mike Radovsky and we'll have all the stuff we're talking about there. Or if you're on your iPhone, you can just click through on the podcast app and you'll see the show notes right there as the episode's playing. You can just click right through the links with your finger. Thanks for listening. We'll see you guys in just a moment for the jam session. Hey everybody, it's Lid Shaw, and I want to thank you so much for listening to this episode of Recording Studio Rockstars. I really appreciate you, and I really appreciate your time. And as a way of saying thank you, I've created a special mix tutorial just for you, Rockstars, totally free, called the Mix Master Bundle. With it, you get over 2 hours of detailed videos watching over my shoulder as I mix a song in my studio. Plus, I give you the free ebook that explains how I recorded the tracks And you get downloadable multi-tracks so that you can practice your mixes, including the Pro Tools session file, using nothing but stock plugins in Pro Tools, all of which you would find in any other DAW, whether you're on Logic or Studio One or Reaper. Maybe you're struggling with trying to improve your mix technique, or maybe you just simply don't have access to multi-track files or can't record a full drum set in your studio. I wanted to give you a chance to create your own mixes from full drum kit, bass, and guitars recorded in my studio. The song is called American Winter, and it's off my instrumental record, Skadoosh, and it's all available for you totally free right now. All you need to do to get it is text Mix Master Bundle to 33444, and I'll send it directly to your email. Again, that's Mix Master Bundle with no space to 33444, or you can go directly to mixmasterbundle.com, enter your email, and I'll send all the files directly to you. Thanks so much, rock stars. We'll see you guys in the jam session. Cheers. Hey, rock stars, we're back, and I'm here with my guest, Mike Radovsky. We're about to jump into the jam session. Thanks so much for listening. Mike, are you ready to jam?
I'm ready.
All right, dude. So when you got started out in recording, playing drums, producing music for libraries, what was one of the things that was really holding you back from getting going?
Well, for me, I guess in some ways it was maybe a good thing, but in other ways a bad thing. I started real late. I was in college and just kind of had like a little drum set as sort of like a hobby. And I'd always loved music and liked all different kinds of music, which was really helped me in my composing for TV and film, because I'm kind of like a nerd scientist with, different styles and what makes that style sound the way it is. But that said, I didn't really get serious about drums till my last year of college, which, I was a history major, so pretty unrelated. And I wasn't in a band till I was basically out of college. So starting late, I always feel like I get into everything like 10 years too late. I moved to Nashville 10 years too late. I started playing drums 10 years too late.
That's sort of how I feel too. I kind of I didn't pick up a guitar until I was a senior in high school. I didn't decide to do music until that I already finished a college degree in architecture, and then kind of decided I wanted to come down here. But keep going. So that was a struggle for you, starting late.
Yeah, just feeling, I always felt like I had to play catch up and never just felt like quite there. So that's been, and I still, I'm sort of a self-loather, so I'm always kind of hard on myself about stuff.
Well, I think many of our rock stars listening in right now may even be closer to our age, might be, over 40 and be in a place where they've sort of maybe set aside music a little bit for a couple of decades, or just sort of done it as a hobby. And now there's some more time opening up, and they have an opportunity to dig back into it. So I'm sure that there are listeners that can understand that feeling of, I'm really having to do some catch up now. So what's the takeaway? How do you come into something feeling like you're late to the game, but do it anyway?
Well, even though I was young, when you're a kid, everything is still possible. So, and obviously when you're like in college, you're still a kid. So, you're not married, you don't have a mortgage, theoretically. So anything still seems possible, and as we get older, of course, life beats the crap out of you. So you get more realistic. So I only really had a couple of like drum instructors. And one of the teachers I had was really kick my ass. I literally had to practice like, 5-6 hours a day just to prepare for my lessons. So anything's possible. And I know of other musicians that started really late. So basically the only thing I would say to that is, yeah, anything's possible if you're willing to put the work in to it.
Well, that's cool.
Whatever it is.
That's cool. And I like the fact that you sought out mentors and teachers too for drumming, and, that goes for us in recording, mixing, engineering.
Yeah. It's a lifelong. I'm still, buying instructional videos and always trying to learn new stuff. I love to and it gets harder when you're older. That's kind of the issue, because life gets in the way, but I still love getting together with other drummers and playing and studying music.
Well, that's cool, Mike. And so, you jumped in, you learned this stuff. And I know that one of the things that we didn't get a chance to talk about, maybe you can tell us now, that was a pretty cool success moment for you, just a really cool opportunity and a session was you got to do something to do with the music for Reservoir Dogs, the movie, right?
Yeah, it wasn't me composing, but I was in a band called Bedlam, which had its one ignominious release on MCA, and we were promptly dropped in less than a month after its release. But we were on MCA, and the soundtrack for Reservoir Dogs came out on MCA. So there was, I'm assuming, I don't know how all this happened, so I'm assuming there was a connection. But when we would play live, we did kind of a weird version of Magic Carpet Ride, that old Steppenwolf song. And actually, I think it was kind of an idea that I had come, hey, let's do this. And we played it, in sort of an interesting way. This is before anybody knew who Quentin Tarantino, I didn't know who he was, and I'm kind of a big movie nut. We were just asked, hey, can you play your version of Magic Carpet Ride, but make the intro, extra long so they could use it. They had some idea, and they're saying, and it was first described to us as like, a horror sci-fi movie, which it's anything but that. And there was supposed to be some fight scene where they needed this long intro. And so we just go, okay, whatever. And it wasn't real scientifically, it was very general the way we had to do it. But yeah, we went in and recorded it, and that and one other song are the only non-original versions of all the classic songs that are on that record. They're all cover songs.
Do you remember where in the movie we get to listen to the track?
Yeah, I mean, the way the movie was described to us and the scene that it was used in was completely changed by the time they got it. But there's a scene in the movie where they're in a bar, a couple of the guys, the gang, are in a bar. And you just kind of hear, and that's often the way it is in my world, I had a piece of music in Rango that I had to struggle to, to hear where it was. But you're just hearing it for about 10 seconds in the background because it's supposed to be on the jukebox. So That was it. But it's still, just because I love the movie, I can't honestly say it's life-changing, but I thought it was like kind of neat because I love that movie.
It elevates your cool a little bit, right? And Quentin, I don't know if you're listening to this podcast. It's always a possibility, but Mike is just the kind of guy that would make a great character in one of your movies. So I don't know what his acting skills are like.
I don't know what that says about me, but...
All right, cool. So Mike, how about sharing with us some of the best advice that you received?
Well, I mean, as far as like, I would just say this, the music business in whatever aspect of it you're in, whether it's like engineering or being a player or whatever you're doing, you'll hear some people talk about business. Oh, it's a people business. Well, every business is a people business. And
unless it's just you and your garden.
Yeah. Or if you're one of those guys, which I guess it's possible now with the, magic of computer aided recording where you can just do everything yourself.
No, but I mean, unless you're going to buy your own records and be your only customer, it's still a people business.
Yeah. I guess I was thinking in terms of just creating the music, but everything's a people business. And I've seen lots of producers, players, engineers that I might not think of as like the greatest, but their people skills are great. I mean, when all is said and done, yeah, you have to be good, but people want to get along with whoever they're working with. And if you're touring, can they get along with you on a bus? You can't be, nobody wants the wounded, bleeding, annoying artist type, 24 hours a day. So.
Well, the truth is, especially on a tour, you're spending more time not playing music with people on the bus than you are playing music.
Absolutely. Right? Playing is like the least of it,
I mean, last time I did a real tour, I was in a band that was signed to an indie record label. Boy, this is going back to the late 90s, but we were touring around and just doing an opening slot. So it was like 24 hours. Yeah, 24 hours or 23 hours of driving across the country, setting up, tearing down, dealing with stuff, trying to eat, sleep, all that. And getting on stage and playing 20 minutes of music.
Yeah, it'll frazzle you.
And it was like those handful of songs. Like the only thing I got to work on was whether I could figure out how to jump up in the air in that one A chord and land with my Chuck Taylors down on the stage at the right timing and not fall over. That was my one move I worked on.
Well, I'll get you to show that to me at some point.
I never really figured it out. That was the problem. Maybe that's why I'm
well.
not doing that gig anymore. Yeah. All right. So now how about sharing with us a favorite recording tip, hack, or secret sauce, something that our rock stars could use on their next recording session or mix session or whatever?
I love this one. And when you were talking about, and I always, I default to an engineer because I'm not an engineer. I mean, any advice that I would give you about drum sounds is basically just for me doing it for a while and noticing what the engineer does that I like. But that said, there was something that I read about that when Glenn and Andy Johns would work on Zeppelin records, or particularly Zeppelin records, because it was minimal miking, but he got this big sound and 3 mics. And I'm going, okay, where do these mics go? And one of the mics, the big thing for me was I wondered how they got that big sound out of the bass drum, but they also got the punch and the point, and there's no pillow, there's no muffling at all. You'd think it'd just sound like a big, like it would sound like nothing with no definition. Well, one of the mics was behind the drums, so it could pick up the sound of the beater hitting the head. And what that kind of sparked in my mind was, and this is kind of a weird thing, but when you tune your drums and you listen to them, you're sitting behind them. And drums sound completely different from behind than they do from the front. There's more meat, there's more low end, there's basically more of everything, but in particular, more low end. So one of the things I love doing for a particular sound, not for everything, is having 1 or 2 mics behind the drum set. If you've got room, granted, there, because it doesn't have to be like far away, maybe just a couple of feet, behind the drums. But I mean, whenever I would be on a session and the engineer would solo up the overheads, which are basically sort of behind the drums, they're on top, but they're behind, they're not in front. I'd go, wow, other than the fact that the cymbals are too loud, it's like, that sounds great. That's what my drums sound like. So if you have mics that are behind you that are a little lower, so they're not getting tons of cymbals, that to me is like, that's what I feel like my drums sound like. So that might be something you want to try.
That's very cool. When you were describing the sound as, all those benefits of what it sounds like behind the drums, I almost envisioned you saying, and so therefore when you're on stage, turn your drum set around the other way and face backwards.
Well, in a thing like that, it would work. And there was even I can't remember what, Rush song it was, but there's some song on one of their records where Neil Peart wore a PZM mic on his chest.
Right, the chest mic, yeah.
Yeah, and you and it was kind of, maybe kind of a weird way to do it, but it was for the same reason, so you could get, that perspective from, what the drums sound like from the driver's seat. Yeah,
another good experiment is just putting mics where your ears are, the drummer's ears are, and see what that's. It's, experiment. Try different stuff.
But, just get them somewhere behind the drums. I mean, I think that's great. It can get a great sound.
All right, Mike. So how about sharing with us a favorite hardware tool for the studio? Something that something physical that on recording sessions always seem, glad you got it.
You mean as far as like my own personal instrument?
Yeah, it can be anything physical that you bring to a recording session that you're like, this always helps.
Oh,
obviously the drums are pretty physical.
Well, sure. Well, one thing, and, I don't know if this is exactly what you're asking, but, once again, back to budgets, but, I generally bring a moderately sized box of percussion instruments to any session I do, because if there's time, and generally, while other guys are overdubbing, I'll do it too, is I love to add shakers, tambourines, little odd instruments to make the track pop. Like I'll use triangles on a lot of things. And one of the things I love with a shaker, and believe it or not, they even used it a lot on the Metallica Black record, is they'll put like a shaker playing, like a 16th or an 8th note subdivision. It's not in your face. It's one of those things that if it's not there, you miss it, but it's kind of like you feel it more than you hear it. So I love using percussion in that way too.
All right, cool, man. That's great advice. I'm glad you answered
Plus,
it that way.
If you're lucky enough to, so if the budget, I'll get paid like extra for being able to overdub.
Right. And we're talking about, particularly Nashville musicians union scale sessions. Really, they accommodate those kind of things. Like they credit you for additional overdubs
Well,
too?
and whether it's union or not, it's like, well, these days, and we're a right to work state. I mean, anything's up for grabs. So you just basically, the walk away is you want to make yourself as valuable as possible. So if you can come in and, overdub on your own tracks. And honestly, and I would throw this in too, one of the things for me that helped a lot was in the, for better or for worse, dreaded unplugged days when, the big drum set sort of lost favor. One of the things that saved me was I seriously learned how to play hand percussion. And I worked for several years, not exclusively playing hand percussion, but it was a lot of my income was playing hand percussion.
Well, so 2 takeaways from what you said. One is over deliver, no matter what we're doing. Find a way to over deliver.
Get there an hour early is not too early.
Well, it is for my
for
sessions.
you, yeah, for you,
but I'm different.
Yeah.
And then the other one is being flexible. So being able to, maneuver and flex with the way your industry changes as you go.
All that.
And in your case, it was like, I know how to play this big kick-ass drum set, but if the world's not looking for kick-ass drum sets right now, well, then I'm going to play some kick-ass hand drums.
There you go. Yeah.
All right. So now how about a favorite software tool in the studio? Something that's pretty badass for people to know about.
Well, we talked about it.
Magneto.
I was going to say,
cool,
I love Magneto. And even if you're not doing something that's period, it sort of gives, and you'd know more about the ins and outs about what it does than I do, but it adds a lot. Of course, the usual stuff, like I love compression and, but all drummers that love big, giant drums love compression.
Any other software tools, anything that you use regularly or plugins that you've always seen people using, or even DAWs that you see most often that you like the best?
Nah, I mean, I have to say, one of the things that's for better or for worse, I'm kind of a delegator. And it's funny for me from my perspective, because I work with so many different, engineers and, like guys like you that have a facility or home studios. And I'm always hearing one guy go, oh, everybody that has Pro Tools thinks, PC-based platforms suck and vice versa. And to me, it's all funny because they're way more similar than they are different. And one of the things I learned, and it's one of my big general things, is I used to think, oh, it's, 50-50 gear and ears. And now I think it's more like 95% gear. 95% ears, 5% gear.
Yeah.
Because some of the guys I work with have like the most modest rigs you can imagine, but their ears are great and they don't need much to make it sound great.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I love that analogy. All right. So now how about a favorite resource for the organizational side of doing stuff? Now, you didn't mention this in software, but I, for one, know that you use SoundCloud regularly. You want to talk about the way that's been useful to you?
Well, I'll mention 2 things. And I've seen the way a lot of people use Facebook. And I'm not one of those. I don't post much, which is maybe kind of stupid. But every once in a while, if I write something that I think is cool, like I posted something we did, like when did we do that? Like 4 years ago, that I recently placed at a library. I'll put it up and, it just kind of reminds people you're around. And I reconnected with people that I hadn't seen or talked to in like 20 years that I ended up, getting library work out of it. So I'm not one of those guys that I don't post my lunch. I don't put, pictures of my dog. I just kind of use it as not a business tool per se, but it's more that than anything else. And for SoundCloud, the way things work now is a lot of any publishing entity is scared about being sued. So they don't want you to send them physical CDs. If you're trying to like get work from somebody you've never worked for, you got to send them something. They don't want MP3s. I think their spam filters will take out anything that's got an attachment on it.
Interesting.
But they all want links. So you kind of have to have something where if you've got, if you're a Reverb Nation guy or just something. For me, I use SoundCloud just because it's easy and it's basically my online resume. I've got like, if any of you guys, and I think Lidge has the link if you want to hear any of my stuff.
Yeah, we'll put it in the show notes. We'll link to some of your tracks.
Yeah, it's just it's just it's got a short little bio, nothing, extravagant. And it's got like maybe, like 35 tracks. And that, when I'm trying to, network with somebody new, whether it's, for playing or composing, I'll just, send a link.
Cool, man. Well, I love SoundCloud. I find it really useful. It's got some features that I wish worked a lot better than it does.
Yeah, me too.
But for the most part, it's been really helpful.
And it's free.
And one of the things I really appreciate about it is I can put up mixes that I'm working on onto SoundCloud. Then later when I'm tooling around in town in the car, I can easily play those back to my car stereo without having to do too much fuss and muss. Right. And I really like that. All right. So now how about business side of doing this stuff? I mean, you've shared a lot of tips already. Do you have any more advice or resources for keeping your money side together and making sure you're, surviving in this world?
Well, it's kind of like what, I see Lidge as being like the guru of not wasting time. He's very organized and everything is scheduled. And we already discussed, like, at some point you have to decide how much time you want to spend chasing down, $50. But that said, for me, as far as composing goes, it was sales. It's that ability to sell yourself. And one of the libraries that I've ended up writing a ton of music for, I literally contacted the guy that he's basically the president of the company, and that he's the guy that assigns all the projects twice a year for 4 years before he gave me a project. And I pretty much was ready to give up because it gave me a newfound respect for my dad, who was a traveling salesman. You kind of sort of look at it like, if you contact 100 people and 5 of them, buy something from you, that's pretty good. And it's the same way with this. And then once you're in there, you're in. Unless you like screw up, but you're pretty much in. But it's like, it's easy to get discouraged. Yeah. And pretty much every library that other than like 1 or 2 that I've worked for, it was, you start out, send a cold email, a cold phone call, and you get through however many levels of flunkies till you get to somebody that can do something. And it just takes time.
That's great advice. And that's advice that I need to hear right now. So Rockstars, even doing this podcast, Recording Studio Rockstars, whether you know it or not, I am daily and weekly frustrated and faced with decisions of, do I keep pushing forward? Do I feel like I want to give up on things. And so,
and you got to walk that line between contacting people. And I still struggle with this, like how much is, out of sight, out of mind. You want to like put a little bug in their ear, as opposed to, I wish this jerk would stop, calling me or emailing me.
But I mean, your takeaway is persistence, is like, choose whatever your mission is and your path, and just stay on it until you finally get to the time where you're like, okay, this is no longer my mission, and then stop. But if it is your mission, just persist, man. Keep going.
Yeah.
Advice we've gotten from other rock stars on the podcast are, that persistence trumps talent every time. I think that came from Matt Ross Spang, which I thought was a great quote. And
absolutely, because it's a people skill. It's the guy. I know so many people that I think are unbelievably talented in a number of things, but particularly as musicians, that just kind of didn't. They just didn't go for it in the same way that people of, I would even dare to say, have much lesser abilities that went far.
Yeah, well, I like to be a living example of that.
Well, yeah, hey, your mouth to God's ears, yeah.
Well, I mean, I was just trying to claim the much lesser.
No, I know.
No, all right, so let's just jump forward here. I'm going to take you to the final question. So now, if you could go back, Mike, and give yourself, your young Mike, advice, if you could give yourself one bit of advice and tell yourself what the single most important thing is to become a recording studio rock star yourself, what would you go back and tell yourself?
It's people skills. It's to me, it's more, I mean, I'd said it before, it's more, I'm not saying, you don't have to have abilities and talents, but it's just every business is a people business. And I would say it's probably more that than anything else.
All right. So now you're today's Mike, going back and talking to young Mike. You're explaining it's people skills and people business, which we've talked about on the podcast here. Would you be nice to young Mike telling him that, or would you go kick his ass?
I'd kick his ass.
All right. Fair enough. All right, Rockstars, thanks so much for listening. Mike, thank you for being here on Recording Studio Rockstars with us. Let us know how we can find you, how we can follow you, and learn more about your work and your music.
Yeah, I'm on, if you catch the spelling of my name, I'm on Facebook. And that's not, it's somewhat business, but I would direct you to SoundCloud.
Let's spell it out for him.
My last name is spelled Radovsky, and I think it's up as Mike as opposed to Michael.
Okay, cool. Groovy. So we'll find you on SoundCloud. Check out all your awesome music. And hopefully we'll just see more of you around the studio.
I hope so.
All right, dude. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, man.
Cheers. Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, please leave a rating and review on iTunes to help reach more people. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And if you want more free content, all you have to do is text RS Rockstars to 33444. Again, that's RS Rockstars to 33444, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, and podcast updates. And I'll let you know about any upcoming giveaway offers, all totally free. Thanks for listening. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.